Welcome to Wickless Night. There is something different about a night with no light at all, no candle burning, no lamp in the corner, just darkness, silence, and the feeling that something may be closer than it should be. Tonight's stories come from people who lived through moments they still cannot explain. A sound in an empty room, a stranger at the door, a shadow that moved when no one else was there. Before we step into the dark, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy slow, unsettling, true horror stories, subscribe to Wickless Night. Get comfortable. The lights are already gone.
About 2 years ago, I was camping with my family in Namibia, and during that trip I had 2 nighttime experiences involving animals that could not have felt more different. The first one genuinely terrified me. The second one scared all of us for a few seconds, and then became almost funny. We were traveling through Namibia and stopped for our first night at an abandoned campsite near a dry riverbed. The campsite was high up on a kopje, which is basically a rocky formation, too small to really call a mountain, but much bigger and rougher than an ordinary hill. The whole area was surrounded by rock. It was beautiful during the day. At night, it felt much more isolated. There were no normal campsite noises, no neighboring families, no generators running nearby, no people walking around with flashlights. It was just us, the rocks, the riverbed below, and whatever animals were moving through the area after dark. The campsite being abandoned added to the atmosphere, although nothing unusual had happened when we arrived. We set up our tents around the rocky terrain. Because of the way the kopje was shaped, the tents were not all directly beside one another. Large pieces of rock and natural formation separated some of us. You could still call out if you needed someone, but when you were inside your own tent, you could not necessarily see the others. That did not bother me at first. We spent the evening around the fire. We made toasted cheese sandwiches. We talked. We watched the stars. Namibia at night can feel enormous because once you get away from populated areas, there is so little artificial light. The sky seemed endless. It was one of those camping evenings where everything felt calm enough that you almost forgot how far away you were from normal houses, streets, and locked doors. Eventually, everyone started getting ready for bed. We separated and went to our tents. I climbed into mine and zipped it shut. I was not trying to fall asleep immediately. I still had my phone, so I started playing Geometry Dash for a while before bed. That is probably why the first sound caught my attention so sharply. I was completely focused on the screen. Then, I heard rocks move outside. A small slide. Something shifted on the rocky ground. Then, a stone came down and hit the side of my tent. I stopped playing. At first, I did not panic. There were plenty of reasons rocks could move on a kopje. Loose stones settle. Small animals move through them. Wind can disturb things. Maybe someone from my family had walked nearby. I looked through the mesh section of the tent. Nothing. From inside, I could only see a limited area. Beyond that was darkness. I listened for a little while. Nothing obvious happened. So eventually I went back to my phone. A few minutes later, I heard something else. Sniffing, that sound was completely different from a rock moving. It sounded close. Very close. Something was right outside my tent. I stopped moving. I listened. There it was again. An animal sniffing around the fabric. My immediate thought was that some wild animal had come to investigate us. That alone was enough to make me nervous. We were camping in Namibia. This was not a backyard. There were animals in the area that you absolutely did not want walking around your tent in the middle of the night. I slowly looked through the mesh again, and that was when I saw it. A leopard. It was circling my tent. Even now, I remember the shock of realizing how close it was. This was not an animal somewhere across the riverbed. It was not a pair of eyes on a distant ridge. It was right there, moving around the outside of the tent. Sniffing, investigating, the thin material between us suddenly felt completely useless. A tent gives you psychological comfort when camping because it feels like a little room. You zip it closed. Your sleeping bag is inside. Your belongings are around you. For a few hours, you almost forget that the walls are just fabric. Seeing a leopard outside instantly removes that illusion. There is no real barrier. If an animal that powerful decided it wanted inside, the tent itself would not stop it. I went completely silent. I did not call out to my family. I did not reach for the zipper. I did not want to make any sudden noise or movement that might increase its interest. I even found myself holding my breath. I know realistically a leopard could probably already smell me perfectly well through the tent. Holding my breath was not going to make me disappear. But fear does not always produce logical behavior. My instinct was simply, do not move. Do not make noise. Do not give it another reason to focus on you. So I lay there. I watched when I could. Listened when I could not see it. The animal continued circling. It seemed to be sniffing the tent and the area around it. I could not tell exactly what it wanted. Maybe it was curious. Maybe it smelled food. Maybe it smelled me. Maybe it was simply passing through the campsite and investigating this strange new object sitting on its territory. At the time, none of those explanations made me feel better. I was convinced it had taken some kind of interest in me personally. Every time I heard movement around the tent, I imagined it deciding whether to come closer. I did not know what I was supposed to do. Calling out might scare it away, or maybe shouting would startle it. Getting out of the tent was obviously not something I wanted to try, so I stayed where I was. Eventually, the leopard moved away. From what I could tell, it went down the copy. The sounds faded. I could no longer see it. But that did not mean I immediately relaxed. Once you have seen a leopard walking around your tent at night, silence is no longer reassuring. Silence just means you do not know where the leopard is. For all I knew, it had stopped somewhere outside my field of view. Maybe it was watching. Maybe it had gone toward another tent. Maybe it was sitting 20 feet away. I had no way to know. I barely slept. Every little movement outside became suspicious. A small rock shifting. Wind. An insect. Anything. My brain immediately returned to the leopard. Is it back? I stayed inside the tent until morning. Even after the sun came up, I still did not feel safe enough to immediately unzip the door and step outside. That sounds ridiculous in daylight, but I had spent the entire night building the animal into something that could still be waiting nearby. The morning light did not instantly erase that fear. I looked through the mesh, waited, listened. I knew my family would eventually be moving around, but I still hesitated. It took me nearly 2 hours to finally build up enough courage to leave the tent. Once I did, I told everyone what had happened. I explained the rock, the sniffing, looking out, seeing the leopard, watching it circle my tent, then seeing it move away down the copy. I expected them to react more strongly. Instead, I got the feeling some of them were not completely convinced. That was frustrating because the experience had felt so clear to me. I had not just heard an animal. I believed I had actually seen it. But there was a problem. We had a camera set up near the vehicle. We would place it each night in the hope of capturing wildlife. It was pointed towards some meat we had left out specifically to attract animals into view. Naturally, after I told everyone about the leopard, we checked the camera. Nothing. No leopard. No clear footage showing a big cat moving through the campsite. That made my story much harder to prove. We also looked around for tracks. But the campsite was on rocky ground. There was not much soft sand or mud where an animal would leave beautiful, obvious footprints. We found maybe one or two marks that could have been tracks, but my family thought they looked old. There was nothing like a clean line of fresh leopard prints circling my tent. So from their perspective, there was no physical evidence, no camera footage, no clear, fresh tracks. Only my story. I think that is why some of them did not really believe me. But the lack of camera footage does not necessarily mean an animal was not there. The camera was pointed toward the meat. My tent was not necessarily directly in its field of view. If the leopard came from another direction, circled my tent, then moved back down the rocks without approaching the bait, the camera could easily miss it. Wild animals do not have any obligation to walk through the exact section you are recording. The meat might not have interested it. Maybe it had already eaten. Maybe it noticed human scent and avoided the bait. Maybe the camera angle simply did not cover the path it took. The absence of footage only tells us the camera did not record a leopard where it was pointing. It does not prove there was no leopard elsewhere. The rocky terrain makes the track problem similar. People imagine large animals always leave obvious footprints, but tracks depend heavily on the ground. Soft mud, great, wet sand, easy, loose dust, possible solid rock and stones, not so much. An animal can cross hard ground and leave almost nothing a normal person would recognize. Even if those one or two prints were fresh, we had no way to date them precisely. Maybe they were old, maybe they were from the night before. Without an experienced tracker examining them, we were guessing. So the lack of tracks never convinced me that I had imagined the whole thing. At the same time, I understand why my family was skeptical. It was dark. I was alone. I had been lying in a tent playing on my phone. The first thing I heard was rocks moving, then sniffing. I looked through mesh under poor lighting. Could I have misidentified another animal as a leopard? It is possible. Night vision is unreliable. Tent mesh can distort details. If you are looking through a small opening, you only see part of an animal at a time. Maybe it was a smaller wildcat. Maybe another animal with a similar body shape. Maybe something moved close enough that my brain filled in the details. I do not think that is what happened, because the image in my memory is very specific. But I have to admit, the conditions were not ideal for identification. I was frightened. Fear makes the brain classify things quickly. In Namibia, if you see a spotted or cat-shaped animal at night and immediately think leopard, every movement afterward gets interpreted through that label. Once you have decided a dangerous predator is outside, the body does not care about careful zoological identification. It just wants you to survive. There is also the possibility that the leopard was genuinely there, but was much less interested in me than I believed. That is probably what I think now. At the time, it is hunting me. It knows I am here. It wants something from me. Now, it may have been curious about a strange fabric structure in its environment. Animals investigate scents. Humans had recently set up camp. We cooked food. There was meat elsewhere around the campsite. We had been walking everywhere. The area would have been full of unfamiliar smells. My tent may simply have been one thing the animal checked before moving on. The fact that it eventually left without doing anything supports that. It did not attack the tent, did not paw at it, did not try to get inside. It sniffed, circled, left. That sounds more like investigation than active aggression. But when you are alone behind a layer of tent fabric, that distinction does not matter emotionally. A curious leopard is still a leopard. Another thing that bothered me afterward was the rock hitting the tent. At the time, I connected that directly to the animal. Something moved on the rocky slope. A stone slid down, hit the tent. Then, minutes later, I heard sniffing. That sequence makes sense if the leopard was already moving nearby. Its weight could disturb loose rock. The stone rolls. I look. Nothing visible. The leopard continues moving, eventually comes close enough for me to hear it sniff. That is probably what happened. But the rock may also have been unrelated. Rocky terrain shifts. An animal much smaller than a leopard could move a loose stone. Wind, temperature changes. Anything, then later another animal appeared. The two events become one story because they happened close together. Again, timing makes things look connected even when they may not be. What I am much more confident about is the sniffing. Something living was close. A repeated sniff near the tent is difficult to confuse with a rock settling. And once I looked out, I saw a large cat-like animal moving around. Whatever the exact species or size, I do not think the entire experience came from nothing. There was an animal. The uncertainty is what kind and how interested it actually was. I also think my family not immediately believing me made the memory stronger. If the camera had captured a perfect image of a leopard beside my tent, the story would be settled. Everyone would say, "There it is. You were right." Then we would talk about how dangerous or lucky the encounter was. Instead, the camera showed nothing. Now I had experienced something terrifying that only I could confirm. That makes you replay the memory. Was it really a leopard? Did I see it clearly? Could something else produce the same shape? You end up defending the experience to yourself because nobody else can verify it. But even if I was wrong about some visual detail, the fear was not imaginary. Something was outside the tent. I heard it. I saw movement. I spent the night believing a predator was feet away. That experience was real, even if the exact animal remains uncertain. The trip gave us another big cat scare later, except that one ended very differently. For our last night, we decided to do something much more comfortable. We went to the White Lady Elephant Lodge. Compared with the abandoned campsite, this felt almost luxurious. We were still sleeping in tents, but there was a pool. After days of more basic camping, having access to something like that felt glamorous. When we arrived, a woman at reception gave us a warning. She told us not to wander too far away from our tents at night because lions had recently been sighted in the area. That warning immediately stayed in everyone's mind. You do not hear lions have been seen nearby and then forget it 10 minutes later. It changes the way you look into the darkness. Later that night, we were around the campfire. We had headlamps. At some point, we started playing around with the lights, shining them into nearby bushes and across the darkness. Then our beams hit a bush. 2 pairs of eyes reflected back. 4 bright points. Cat eyes. Everyone froze. For a second, the warning from reception became the only thought any of us had. Lions, there are lions around here. And now there are 2 pairs of feline eyes looking at us from a bush. The entire group got nervous. It is amazing how little information you need for fear to create the rest. We could not see bodies clearly at first, just eyes. But the brain already knew what it expected. Lion sightings, dark bush, 2 sets of eyes, therefore lions. Then the animals stepped forward, and our terrifying lions turned into 2 stray cats. Normal little cats. We all breathed again. The difference between the fear and the reality was almost ridiculous. Only seconds earlier, those eyes belonged to large predators in our minds. Then, the owners of the eyes walked into better light, and the threat disappeared completely. We ended up spending the rest of the night trying to gain their trust. We gave them leftovers, poured out some water, They seemed to live around the campsite, or at least spend enough time there to know humans meant food. What had started as, there are two lions watching us, turned into, let's make friends with the cats. That experience made me think about the leopard night differently afterward. Because at the lodge, every person there made the same mistake for a few seconds. We had been warned about lions. We saw cat eyes. Our brains immediately created lions. The external stimulus was real. There genuinely were animals in the bushes. But our first identification was wrong, because expectation filled in what darkness hid. That is exactly the kind of thing that could have happened to me at the abandoned campsite. Maybe there was a real animal outside my tent. Maybe I genuinely saw a cat-shaped body. But because I knew where we were and knew what animals might exist there, my brain upgraded uncertainty into a leopard. The second experience proved how easy that is. At the same time, the two situations were not identical. At the lodge, once the cats stepped into better light, everyone immediately saw what they were. At the first campsite, I never got that second look. I saw the animal only under bad conditions. Then it disappeared down the rocks. So my first interpretation never had a chance to be corrected. That leaves the leopard identification open. Maybe I was completely right. Maybe not. If I had turned on a strong light and the animal had stepped clearly into view, the question would be gone. But using a bright light on an unknown predator outside your tent at night is not exactly the kind of experiment I wanted to try. I was more interested in staying unnoticed. So the encounter remains unresolved in a way the stray cat scare does not. The second story also shows how warnings shape perception. The woman at the lodge said, "There have been lions." After that, every pair of reflective eyes had the potential to become a lion. At the abandoned campsite, we were already in an environment where large wildlife was possible. I knew that. Then I heard something substantial enough to disturb rocks. Something sniffed the tent. My mind had all the ingredients it needed to produce the most dangerous, reasonable animal. That does not mean the leopard was imaginary. It means context mattered. Animals can also look much larger at night than they are. Without clear reference points, a medium-sized cat close to the tent could seem bigger. Tent mesh reduces detail. Moonlight and darkness hide scale. If only parts of the animal are visible at once, the brain constructs the rest. So perhaps I saw a smaller cat species or some other animal and interpreted the outline as leopard-sized. Again, possible, but I remember the body as unmistakably large enough to frighten me. I cannot reduce the memory beyond that. One thing I definitely learned on the trip was that eyeshine is incredibly deceptive. Those two stray cats taught us that. In darkness, a pair of shining eyes seems to float without scale. They could belong to a house cat 5 meters away or a much larger animal farther back. You need body shape, movement, height, spacing, and context before you can identify anything. We had almost none of that when we first saw them. So naturally, we selected the animal we had been warned about. Fear is fast. Identification is slower. That is probably a useful way of understanding both events. At the first campsite, fear made a decision before careful identification was possible. At the second, we got enough extra information to correct it. The other major difference was numbers. At the abandoned campsite, I was alone inside my tent. Everyone else was separated by rock formations. There was nobody beside me saying, "I see it too." That makes fear much stronger. At the lodge, we were all around the fire together. Even when we thought the eyes belonged to lions, we were a group. We had light. We had other people. The lodge itself was occupied. There was staff nearby. That gave the second event a safety net. The first one had none. Inside that tent, I felt completely isolated. I could have called my family. but I did not know what doing that would cause. Maybe someone would unzip their tent and walk directly toward the animal. That thought alone may have kept me quiet. If I shouted leopard, what would everyone do? Turn on lights? Come outside? Panic? I had no idea. So silence seemed safer. Whether that was actually the best wildlife response is not something I can judge confidently from a frightened memory. I only know what I chose. Stay still. Stay quiet. Wait, eventually, it worked in the sense that the animal left. The 2-hour delay the next morning sounds excessive now, but I understand it. The night had trained me to think outside tent equals leopard. Sunrise does not instantly erase that association. I needed to hear normal family activity, see people walking around, see that nothing was waiting nearby. Only then could I force myself to open the zipper. That is how strong fear can be after a close animal encounter. The danger may already be gone. Your body does not know that. It keeps behaving as if the last confirmed information is still true. Last confirmed information, large predator outside. Therefore, stay inside. The camera was supposed to give objective evidence, but because it captured nothing, the psychological uncertainty survived. I sometimes imagine how different the story would feel if there were one photograph. A leopard passing behind my tent. No doubt. Or alternatively, a jackal or smaller cat. Mystery solved in the other direction. Instead, nothing. That blank camera became almost as memorable as the sighting. It did not prove me wrong, but it denied me proof that I was right. I think that is why the family's disbelief bothered me. I had been terrified for hours. Then morning came and everyone else could continue the trip normally. For them, no footage, no fresh tracks, probably not a leopard. For me, I watched it walk around my tent. Those are completely different positions. Neither side had enough evidence to settle it. I cannot blame them for wanting something physical. I also cannot make myself believe I invented the whole experience. The safest conclusion is probably somewhere in between. A real animal came close to my tent. I had a brief nighttime view through mesh. I identified it as a leopard. That identification may have been correct, especially in a place where such wildlife is possible. But because there was no independent confirmation, I cannot prove it. That does not reduce the story. If anything, it makes it more honest. What I remember is not, I definitely proved a leopard stalked me. What I remember is, I was alone in a tent on a rocky campsite in Namibia, heard something outside, looked through the mesh, and saw what I believed was a leopard slowly circling and sniffing around me. That is scary enough. There is no need to exaggerate it into an attack. The animal never tried to get inside. It never lunged. It never growled at me. It simply investigated and eventually left. The fear came from what it could have done, not what it actually did. That is often worse. Possibility gives imagination unlimited room. A leopard actually attacking creates a specific emergency. A leopard quietly sniffing the tent leaves you wondering what it is deciding. Is it curious? Hungry? Does it know exactly what is inside? Will it leave? Every second becomes anticipation. That was the terror. The later stray cats were the opposite. The fear existed only until we got more information. Eyes, possible lions. Cats walk out. Fear collapses. Then, we fed them. I like that those two experiences happened during the same trip because they almost balance each other. One taught me how real wildlife danger can feel when there is no barrier between you and the darkness. The other taught me how easily darkness can turn harmless animals into exactly the predators you are expecting. Maybe that second lesson should make me question the leopard more. It does. but it does not erase the first experience. I still remember the sniffing, still remember looking out, still remember the shape moving around the tent, still remember holding my breath as if that could somehow hide me. And I remember waiting for the morning while every tiny rock sound made me think it had returned. Maybe the camera simply missed it. Maybe those 1 or 2 prints were actually fresh. Maybe my family dismissed them because they had no reason to believe my story yet. Or maybe the animal was something else, and my frightened brain gave it the most dangerous identity available. I will probably never know. The campsite was temporary. We moved on. The rocks kept no clear record. No one else saw what I saw. That is enough uncertainty to keep the memory alive. But whenever I think about that trip, I also remember the final night. The warning about lions. The headlamps swinging toward a bush. 2 pairs of eyes reflecting back. Everyone suddenly going quiet. Then 2 little stray cats casually walking into the light while an entire group of people realized they had just mentally turned house cats into lions. We laughed, fed them leftovers, gave them water, spent the evening trying to get them comfortable around us. That was the harmless version of the same basic fear. Something is in the dark. You cannot see enough. Your brain supplies the rest. Maybe the first night was like that too. Maybe not. The difference is that on the first night, whatever was sniffing around my tent never stepped into good enough light to give me a second answer. So in my memory, it is still the same animal I believed it was when I first looked through the mesh. A leopard, moving slowly around a thin tent on an abandoned copy while my entire family slept behind separate walls of rock. And even if someone could prove to me now that it had only been some smaller animal, I do not think that would erase the feeling of lying absolutely still in the dark, hearing it breathe and sniff only a layer of fabric away, and realizing how little protection a zipped tent really gives you when something wild decides to come close. When I was around 6 years old, I had already developed a habit for nights when I could not sleep. I would go to my grandparents' room. It was not unusual for me. If I woke from a nightmare or started feeling frightened in my own room, I knew I could leave my bed, walk down the hallway, climb into theirs, and eventually calm down enough to sleep. For a 6-year-old, that felt like the safest place in the house. The problem was that during the weeks leading up to this particular night, I had been doing it constantly. I had been having terrible nightmares. I do not remember every dream now, but I remember the effect they had on me. I would wake up frightened, leave my room, and crawl into bed with my grandparents. Then it would happen again, another night, and another. Eventually, they started getting tired of it. Not because they did not care about me, but because being repeatedly woken in the middle of the night was exhausting. I knew they wanted me to start staying in my own bed. So on this night, when I found myself unable to sleep again, I tried to be brave, or at least as brave as a 6-year-old can be alone in a dark bedroom. I stayed where I was. I told myself I did not need to go wake them. There was nothing wrong. The house was quiet. I was safe. I just needed to close my eyes and fall asleep. For a while, I tried. Then I heard something from the living room. My bedroom shared a wall with it, so sounds from that room could carry clearly enough for me to notice. I cannot remember exactly what the noise was anymore. Maybe something shifting, a knock, a creak, some small movement. Whatever it was enough. At 6 years old, after weeks of nightmares and while already struggling to sleep, that sound became the last thing I was willing to tolerate. I decided I was going to my grandparents'. Immediately, there was no longer any debate about being brave. If there was a fight or flight response happening in my little 6-year-old body, I had absolutely chosen flight. I got out of bed. I did not want to make much noise. Part of me was afraid of waking my grandparents again and getting in trouble for refusing to stay in my own room. Another part of me was afraid of whatever I imagined had made the noise in the living room. So I started moving carefully. I crept out of my bedroom. Then I made my way into the hallway. The living room was off to one side. As I moved past the doorway, I looked to my right. I wish I had not. I slowly peeked around the edge of the doorframe. And there, standing on top of the glass coffee table in the middle of the living room, was a woman. At least, that is what I saw. She was pale. White enough that the word apparition is still the easiest way for me to describe her. She appeared to be wearing old-fashioned clothing, not simply an old dress. The style reminded me of something from the colonial period or another much earlier era. Long clothing. A shape and silhouette that did not look anything like what the adults around me normally wore. For a second, I just stared. I could not understand why anyone would be standing on the coffee table. That detail alone felt completely wrong. Adults did not stand on furniture, especially not on a glass coffee table, and there should not have been a strange woman in the living room in the middle of the night. I remember her body looking unnaturally still. Then she began to turn toward me, slowly, but there was something awkward about the movement. That is one of the details that stayed with me most strongly. It did not look like a normal person simply turning their head after noticing someone. It looked restricted, as if something were keeping her from moving properly. Her head seemed unable to turn naturally. Her body and face shifted toward me in this stiff, unnatural way. At 6, I had no explanation for it. I only knew I did not like it. Then, she looked at me, and her expression changed. Her face flashed into a smile, not a normal, friendly smile. At least, it did not look that way to me. It was sudden, sharp, the kind of expression that immediately told every frightened part of my brain to run. And then, one of her feet dropped. It did not step normally onto the table. It dropped downward and seemed to dangle there. That was the moment I stopped watching. I ran. I sprinted down the hallway toward my grandparents' room as fast as I could. Any concern I had about waking them was gone. I pushed into their room and told them what I had seen. There was a woman in the living room, on the coffee table. She had looked at me. I was terrified. I do not remember every word I used because I was 6 and panicking, but I remember wanting them to understand that I had not simply heard another strange noise. I believed I had seen someone. My grandmother took me seriously enough that the experience did not simply disappear as another bad dream. At some point afterward, she helped look into the history of the house. What we found, or at least what I remember being told we found, made the whole thing much more frightening. The building was old. Very old. There appeared to be historical connections to the period suggested by the clothing I remembered seeing. Then there was a story associated with the house. According to what we found or were told, a maid who had lived or worked there had died by suicide after suffering abuse from the man of the household, who was also supposedly abusive toward his wife. When I heard that, the figure in the living room suddenly seemed to have an identity. A woman in old-fashioned clothing, standing strangely above a table, moving as if restrained, a dangling foot. Then a historical story about a maid who had hanged herself. At 6 years old, that connection felt impossible to dismiss. I had seen her. That was what I believed. I had somehow seen the woman who died in that house. Even years later, the sequence is difficult to think about without getting a chill. But as an adult, or even just as someone older looking back, I also have to separate the things I actually experienced from the things I learned later. What I experienced that night was a frightening visual image. What I learned afterward was a story about the history of the building. Those two things feel connected now, but I cannot know how accurate every historical detail was. Old houses collect stories. Families repeat them. Neighbors repeat them. Sometimes records confirm parts of them. Sometimes one real event gets mixed with rumor until the story becomes much more specific than the evidence ever was. I was only 6. I was not personally reading historical documents and evaluating sources. My grandmother was helping me. What I remember now is the conclusion. Old house. Maid, abuse, hanging. That does not necessarily mean every piece was independently verified exactly as I remember it. That is important, because the later story may also have changed how I remembered the figure. Maybe the clothing originally just looked like a long white dress. After learning the house had an old history, it became colonial-era clothing. Maybe the foot movement originally looked strange, but not specifically connected to hanging. After hearing the maid's story, the dangling leg gained a much darker meaning. Memory is not a video recording, especially memory from 6 years old. Later information can become attached to an earlier experience until it is difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. That does not mean I invented the original sighting. I remember being frightened before I knew anything about the maid. Whatever I saw was enough to make me run to my grandparents immediately. But the exact details may have become sharper after the historical story gave them meaning. The fact that I had been having weeks of nightmares matters too. That is probably the strongest ordinary explanation. I was already sleeping badly, already frightened at night, already repeatedly waking and going to my grandparents. On this particular night, I was trying to force myself to stay in my own bed despite being uncomfortable. That means I may have been drifting in and out of sleep for some time before I finally got up. A 6-year-old who has been struggling to sleep can easily be in that strange border between dreaming and being fully awake. People sometimes experience extremely vivid images during those transitions, not just vague shadows. People, faces, animals, figures standing in doorways. They can appear inside the real room. The person experiencing it may be able to move completely normally. They may walk, turn their head, run, talk. So this does not have to be classic sleep paralysis. A dream image can briefly continue into waking perception. Maybe that is what I saw. Perhaps I left my bedroom while still partly inside a nightmare. I looked into the living room. There were real objects there. The glass coffee table, furniture, dark shapes, moonlight or streetlight, and my half-awake brain supplied the moon. That could explain why she looked so pale and indistinct. It could also explain the unnatural movement. Dream characters often move strangely. A person turns without normal body mechanics. A face changes expression too quickly. A limb appears in a position that does not make physical sense. In a normal dream, you accept it. When the dream is layered onto your actual living room, it becomes terrifying. The coffee table itself could have helped create the figure. Glass reflects light. At night, a glass table can produce odd doubled shapes, reflections from windows, light from another room. Furniture reflected at strange angles. A pale curtain or fabric somewhere nearby could appear to stand upright when seen from the hallway. If I looked only briefly from around a doorframe, my brain had very little visual information to work with. At 6, I would not have stopped and examined the geometry. I saw a person. That was enough. The old-fashioned clothing may have come from folds in curtains, upholstery, or reflected fabric. Children also have less experience identifying ambiguous shapes. Adults can see a coat hanging on a chair and recognize immediately coat. A child can see the same shape in darkness and get woman. Our brains are designed to find human forms quickly, faces especially. That is useful most of the time. In darkness, it produces false alarms. The strange sound from the living room may have primed me before I even looked. I was already afraid. I had heard something. I had decided something might be there. Then I peeked around the corner. My brain was not neutrally asking, what collection of furniture and shadows is in this room? It was asking, what made that noise? That question assumes an agent. Someone, something, so a vague light-colored shape had a much greater chance of becoming a person. Then, once I perceived a woman, every visual change became intentional. A shadow shifts. She turns. Light changes. She smiles. A reflection moves. Her foot drops. The sequence feels alive because the first interpretation gives everything after it meaning. That could explain the entire event without requiring a ghost. There's also the possibility that I saw an actual person. Maybe my grandmother, another family member, someone who had gotten up and moved through the room, but standing on the coffee table makes that difficult. Could perspective have fooled me? Absolutely, if a person stood behind the glass table, especially in dim light. I may have interpreted their feet as being on top of it. A transparent table does not give strong depth cues. Someone behind it can look like they are standing on it. If that person wore a nightgown, robe, or pale clothing, they might look completely different in darkness. Maybe someone was adjusting a curtain or reaching for something. They noticed me, turned, smiled, one foot stepped down or changed position. I panicked before recognizing them. That is physically possible. But I would expect the person to be identified afterward. My grandparents would probably have said, that was me, or that was someone else in the house. As far as I remember, nothing like that happened. Still, this was a childhood memory. I cannot reconstruct every adult conversation. Maybe my grandmother knew there was no one in the room and therefore started researching the house. Or maybe the story became more dramatic through retelling. I honestly cannot know. The expression is another part I question now. I remember the chilling smile. But fear changes faces. A neutral expression can look hostile when you are terrified. Low light removes detail from the eyes while teeth remain bright. That alone can create a disturbing smile. If the figure was partly a reflection, the face may not even have been a face in the normal sense. A change in light could suddenly create a mouth-like curve. The brain then locks onto it. Smiling woman. Run, the awkward turn, also has ordinary possibilities. If the woman was created by a combination of shadows and objects, it would not move like a person, because it was not one. A changing reflection can rotate strangely. A curtain shifting in air may appear to turn while the upper part barely moves. Something hanging from a hook can twist. The movement would look unnatural, precisely because there was no human skeleton underneath it. My 6-year-old brain could interpret that as something is holding her there. That thought becomes much more significant after learning the later story about the maid. The dangling foot is probably the most disturbing part because of that later connection, but I have to be especially cautious with it. Did I truly see a foot drop? Or did I see the lower part of the figure change shape? At 6, in darkness, from a hallway? Those are not necessarily the same thing. Something pale could have fallen from a chair. A blanket, a piece of fabric, a reflected object. The brain already saw a woman, so the movement became her foot. Then later, maid died by hanging. Now the foot becomes a horrifying confirmation. That is exactly how later knowledge can organize an earlier memory. I do not mean that as an accusation against my younger self. Memory does this automatically. Nobody has to consciously change the story. If you remember an unexplained pale figure and then discover a legend about a dead woman, the two memories naturally merge. Each time you tell the story, they reinforce each other. Eventually, it becomes impossible to imagine one without the other. There is also the question of how much a 6-year-old knew about historical clothing. Would I really have thought colonial-era garb before learning anything about the house? Probably not in those exact words. I might have thought she looked like someone from an old movie, or wore a long dress. The specific historical category likely came later. That does not weaken the experience. It just helps separate original perception from later interpretation. The strongest original facts are probably these. I was having nightmares. I heard a noise. I left my bedroom. I looked into the living room. I saw something pale that looked like a woman. It seemed to be standing unusually high near or on the glass coffee table. It appeared to turn toward me. Its expression changed in a frightening way. Something about the lower body moved. I ran to my grandparents. Those pieces alone make a powerful childhood scare. The historical story came afterward. And the historical story is what transformed terrifying thing I saw into possible ghost of someone who died there. Whether that transformation was correct is impossible for me to prove. It is also worth considering that I had been having nightmares specifically for weeks before this. That may indicate my sleep was already disturbed enough to produce vivid nighttime experiences. I do not know what caused those nightmares. Stress, childhood fears, changes at home, things I watched, random development. Children go through phases like that. But the timing matters. This was not a completely well-rested child suddenly seeing a woman at noon. This was a 6-year-old in the middle of repeated nighttime fear, awake at an uncertain point in the night, trying to resist going to the grandparents' bed. That is almost ideal territory for dream imagery to cross into waking. Maybe I had been dreaming moments before hearing the living room noise. Maybe part of that dream continued. The figure may even have been connected to one of the recurring nightmares, though I do not remember enough to know. Another possibility is that I briefly fell asleep while walking or standing. That sounds dramatic, but a child moving around while half asleep can perceive real spaces through a dream-like state. Sleepwalking exists on a spectrum. You do not have to be completely unconscious and wandering through the house with no memory. A person can be confused, partially awake, and visually misinterpret things. Again, I am not diagnosing what happened. I simply know the transition between sleep and wakefulness can produce experiences much stranger than most people realize. The fact that I immediately ran and spoke to my grandparents does not disprove that. Fear can wake someone fully very quickly. The sequence could be partly asleep, see figure, panic, adrenaline, fully awake, run. By the time I reach the bedroom, the internal image is gone, but the memory remains. That fits. What makes me hesitate to simply call it a dream is how clear the room itself felt. I knew where I was. I knew the hallway. I knew the coffee table. I knew the living room. But that is exactly what these waking state experiences can do. The brain does not have to invent the entire environment. It can use the actual environment and add one thing. That is why people report figures at the foot of their real bed rather than finding themselves in a fantasy landscape. The familiar room makes the impossible figure more convincing. There is also the emotional side of my grandparents' response. My grandmother did not simply laugh. She helped investigate the house. That probably told 6-year-old me that there might really be something to investigate. Adults have enormous authority in a child's mind. If Grandma says, let's look up the history, then suddenly the thing is serious. If she then finds a tragic story, that seems to fit, the connection becomes almost unquestionable. I do not blame her. She may have been trying to comfort me by giving the fear a story. Maybe she genuinely believed in ghosts. Maybe she was simply curious. Maybe the house really did have documented history, but her response would have strengthened my belief. Imagine the alternative. If she had walked me into the living room, turned on every light, and shown me a curtain hanging over a chair, perhaps the memory would have ended there. Instead, there was no immediate ordinary explanation. Then history supplied an extraordinary one. That is how legends become personal. The house itself, being old, made it easier. Old houses already feel like they contain previous lives. Different families have slept there, argued there, celebrated there. People have been born and died while the building continued standing. Children understand that in a simple way. If someone once died there, maybe they are still there. That idea can be comforting in some situations, terrifying in others. In my case, the later story matched the image too well. A woman in older clothing, a strange suspended posture, a dangling foot. It felt like evidence. Today, I would say it was a meaningful coincidence, but not proof, especially because the story of the maid itself deserves caution. Stories about abused servants, secret deaths, women in white, and old houses are extremely common in local folklore. Many haunted house legends follow that structure. A servant is mistreated. A woman dies tragically. Her spirit remains. That does not mean this particular story was false. There may have been records. But unless I had the actual documents now, I would not present every detail as established fact. I was 6. I remember what I was told. That is different from having historical verification in front of me today. Even if a maid really did die in the house, that would not prove she was the figure I saw. People die in old buildings. A later strange perception does not automatically connect to one specific deceased person. The connection comes from resemblance. And resemblance is powerful, but not conclusive. The fact that the figure was white also fits an enormous number of ordinary visual effects. White fabric reflects tiny amounts of light strongly. Dark objects disappear. So in a dim room, a pale shape can seem almost self-illuminated. If a curtain, nightgown, blanket, or reflected window occupied part of the scene, it might appear much brighter than everything around it. That could create the apparition effect without anything glowing. At 6, I would simply think, white woman. The glass table also matters because of reflection from below and above. A glass surface can reflect windows, ceilings, lights, and objects behind the viewer. If I was peeking from an angle, the geometry could combine a reflection with something physically behind the table. The result might look like a single upright figure. Then, a slight movement from me changes the reflection. The figure turns. That is exactly the kind of optical situation where moving your own head changes what the object seems to do. If I shifted while hiding behind the doorframe, the reflection could shift too. I might think she was responding to me. In reality, I was moving the angle. The sudden smile could have been another reflection appearing. The dropped foot could have been a piece of the image sliding out of alignment. That is speculative, but physically possible. And it fits the presence of a glass coffee table much better than assuming the table was incidental. Why would a ghost choose to stand on a glass table? A reflected image, on the other hand, would naturally appear connected to the glass. Maybe the thing I thought was standing on top of it was actually inside its reflection. At 6, depth could be very hard to judge from a doorway at night. That explanation interests me because it solves one of the strangest details without needing an actual person balancing on furniture. The table itself may have created the apparition. Maybe some pale object elsewhere in the room or hallway was reflected vertically. I saw it. My tired brain made a woman. Then the nightmare state did the rest. There may never have been a single physical object shaped exactly like her. Several pieces could combine. A reflected curtain as body, a darker object as hair, a highlight as face, a chair leg or fabric as dangling foot. The brain does not need perfect anatomy. It only needs enough clues. Once it recognizes a human form, it fills the gaps. This is the same reason people see faces in clouds, except a face in a cloud during daylight is amusing. A woman on your coffee table at night when you were 6 is terrifying. Whatever the explanation, I know I did not calmly investigate. I saw enough to run. That means I lost my chance to correct the perception. I did not turn on the living room lights. I did not walk around the table. I did not stare long enough for my eyes to adjust. I did not test whether changing my angle changed the figure. I sprinted away. That was completely understandable, but it froze the experience at the moment of maximum uncertainty. The image never got a normal ending. That is important. A lot of childhood fears disappear because eventually the parent turns on the light. Monster becomes coat. Face becomes stuffed animal. Someone under the bed becomes shadow. Mine did not receive that correction. Instead, it received historical confirmation, or what felt like confirmation. So the frightening interpretation survived. I also cannot ignore that I had already been conditioned to escape to my grandparents whenever nighttime fear became too much. That route was practiced. Wake scared, leave room, run to grandparents. This night followed the same pattern, only with a visual event inserted into it. My brain may already have been in a heightened threat state while moving through the hallway. I was not exploring. I was escaping. Then I looked into the one room connected to the noise that had finally driven me out of bed. Of course, I was primed to see something threatening there. None of this means I know exactly what happened. I do not. Maybe I really saw an unexplained figure. I cannot rewind the night. I cannot reproduce the lighting. I cannot inspect the room as it existed then. The house has changed. I have changed. The coffee table may not even exist anymore. All I have is memory. And the memory remains frightening. The woman standing there. The strange turn. The smile. The lower part of her body changing. My sudden certainty that I needed to get away. That fear happened before the history lesson. That matters. Something frightened me independently. The historical story then gave it a name. Maybe the fairest way to describe it is that I had a terrifying childhood perception in an old house, and later learned a story that seemed to match it. That is enough. I do not need to say I definitely saw the dead maid. I also do not need to say I made everything up. Those are not the only two options. A 6-year-old can sincerely see something that looks completely real, while the external cause remains ordinary or unknown. That is probably what happened. But I understand why the supernatural explanation stayed with me. If someone had simply told me the next morning, the house is old, that would mean nothing. Instead, the story supposedly involved a woman from the right general period, a tragic death. Hanging, and suddenly details from my sighting seemed to line up with details I had not consciously been thinking about. That kind of coincidence is powerful. Even adults struggle not to assign meaning to it. For a child, it feels like proof. Years later, I would ask different questions. How reliable were the records? Was the maid's story documented or local folklore? Did I describe the clothing before hearing about the historical period? Did I mention the dangling foot before anyone told me how she supposedly died? Did my grandmother write any of this down at the time? If those answers existed, they would help enormously. But they do not, at least not in my memory. And without them, I have to admit the possibility that later information shaped some of the details. That is not as exciting as saying a ghost revealed herself to me. It is more honest. What I remember most clearly is not even the history. It is the moment of eye contact, or what felt like eye contact. I peeked into a room expecting maybe nothing more than another strange sound. Instead, there was a human shape where no human should be. Then it seemed to know I was there. That is the point where a strange image becomes terrifying. Before the turn, I was observing it. After the turn, it was observing me. Whether anything actually looked back is almost beside the point now. My 6-year-old brain believed it had. And once that happened, the hallway between me and my grandparents suddenly felt much longer than it ever had before. I ran it as fast as I could. I do not remember looking behind me. I doubt I would have dared. Maybe the room was empty the entire time. Maybe the figure disappeared the instant I changed angle. Maybe if I had stayed for one more second, I would have watched it become a curtain, reflection, or piece of furniture. I will never know. I did what frightened children do. I ran toward the adults. And because the mystery was never physically solved, it remained intact. Even now, I can think through all the ordinary explanations. Nightmares, half-awake visual imagery, low light, glass reflections, a pale object, a moving curtain, childhood depth perception. Later memory changes, suggestion from the house history. Every one of those is plausible. Several could have combined. That is much more likely than the idea that a dead woman physically appeared on a coffee table. But probability does not erase memory. Some experiences leave two versions of themselves behind. There's the adult version, probably a sleep-related misperception in a dark room. And there's the childhood version. A woman in old clothing was standing on the glass table. She turned toward me, even though her body did not seem able to move correctly. Her face changed into a smile. Then, her foot dropped, and I ran. Both versions exist in my mind at once. The adult one explains. The child one remembers. I think that is why the experience still bothers me. If it were only a ghost story someone told me later, I could dismiss it. If it were only a nightmare, I could probably forget it. Instead, I have a memory of the real hallway, the real living room, and the real coffee table with something impossible placed inside them. Then, a later story about the house seemed to give that impossible thing a history. Maybe the connection is coincidence. Maybe memory did more editing than I realize. Maybe my grandmother and I found a real record of a tragedy, but that tragedy had nothing whatsoever to do with what I saw. That is probably the safest conclusion. Still, whenever I think back to that house, I do not first remember the research. I remember being 6, trying desperately not to wake my grandparents for another nightmare, hearing something from the living room, finally giving up and deciding I was going to their room anyway. Then creeping down the hallway and making the mistake of looking around the door frame. For years, I thought the frightening part was discovering that an old story about the house seemed to match the woman I had seen. Now I think the part that stays with me most happened before I knew any of that. For one brief moment, I was alone in the hallway, staring at something my frightened 6-year-old mind believed was a woman standing on a glass table. She had not moved when I first saw her. Then, very slowly, she turned toward me. And whatever I actually saw that night, real person, reflection, dream image, shadow, or something I still cannot name. I remember the exact instant it stopped feeling like something I had accidentally noticed. It felt like it had noticed me back.
Before the next story begins, thank you for staying here in the dark. If this is your first visit, subscribe to Wickless Night for more true stories made for the late hours, when the world is quiet and every little noise feels important. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has made you look around the room so far. Now, let's continue.
My senior year of high school, my family moved to a new town in Wisconsin. We rented an old farmhouse about 10 minutes outside town, far enough into the country that nights felt much quieter than what I was used to. There were no close neighbors, no steady traffic outside, and very little light once the sun went down. The house itself was old. At some point in its history, someone had divided it into two apartments, one upstairs and one downstairs. By the time we moved in, it had been turned back into a single house, but the old apartment layout was still obvious. I loved it. I am the youngest in a big family, and by my senior year, most of my siblings had already moved out or were rarely around. After growing up in a house where there was almost always someone nearby, suddenly having most of the upstairs to myself felt incredible. It was basically my own little apartment. There was an upstairs living room, and my bedroom opened directly off it. I had space. Privacy. Quiet at 17 or 18, that felt like luxury. The bedroom door was original to the house, or at least old enough that it looked like it belonged there from the beginning. It was solid wood, heavy, and it did not shut properly. Wisconsin summers get humid, and after decades of swelling and shrinking, the wood had changed enough that the door would catch against the frame. You could close it most of the way, but getting it completely shut usually took effort. It was one of those old house things nobody thought much about. You learn how much pressure a door needs. You know which floorboards make noise. You know which windows stick. After living there for a while, it becomes normal. That door later became the part of the story I had the hardest time explaining. One morning, I was lying in bed sometime around 5. The sun had not fully come up yet, but the sky was starting to turn pink. It was that strange time of morning when the room is not completely dark anymore, but it is not really daylight either. I had woken up naturally and was doing that little argument everyone has with themselves when there is still some time before they actually have to get up. Do I just get out of bed now? Or do I roll over and try to steal another half hour of sleep? I was tired enough that going back to sleep sounded good, but awake enough that I was aware of the room around me. My bed was positioned just inside the bedroom door, immediately to the right. The way I was lying, I was facing toward the doorway. My head was near the wall the door was set into, so if somebody came through that door, they would be very close to me almost immediately. I was lying there, half awake, not thinking about anything frightening. Then I heard running, not a creak, not the house settling, running footsteps. They sounded loud and fast. Someone or something seemed to be moving through the upstairs living room directly toward my bedroom. I remember the reaction happening before I could think about it. I shut my eyes. Instinctively, I do not know why. Maybe some part of me thought that if I did not see whatever was coming, it would somehow be less real. Maybe I thought it was one of my family members and did not want them to know I was awake. Maybe I was just scared. The footsteps came closer. Then, my bedroom door opened. A second later, it slammed shut. Hard, that was when I went from confused to terrified. The door did not normally shut easily. It certainly did not casually swing closed on its own. It had to get past that swollen section of wood where it caught against the frame. But I had heard it open, then slam. I pulled myself into as small a shape as I could under the blanket. My eyes stayed closed. I remember trying not to move, trying not to make noise. My heart was hammering. Then, I felt something on the bed. The mattress shifted. Something seemed to climb onto it. I felt pressure moving around me, not just once. It felt as though something walked in a circle around my body. Step, step, step. The mattress seemed to dip in different places as it moved. It reminded me immediately of an animal finding a comfortable place to lie down. Anyone who has slept with a cat or dog knows the feeling. They climb onto the bed, turn around once or twice, then settle. That was exactly what it felt like. Something walked around me. Then the movement stopped near my feet. The mattress dipped there, and whatever it was seemed to lie down. I stayed completely still. I do not know how long, probably not very long, but when you are terrified and refusing to open your eyes, every second feels stretched. Once my heart slowed a little, I started trying to reason with myself. It had to be a cat. That was the first explanation my brain grabbed. A cat had come upstairs. Maybe I had forgotten one was in the house. Maybe it ran into the room, jumped onto the bed, circled, and lay down. Perfectly normal. That explanation made so much sense that for a moment I felt stupid for being afraid. I told myself to calm down. It is just a cat. Nothing else. I finally opened my eyes. Nothing was there. No cat, no animal. Nothing at the foot of my bed. The blanket was empty. The room looked normal. That was when the fear came back much stronger. I sat up, looked around. There was nowhere obvious for an animal to have gone. I had not felt anything jump off. I had not heard claws hit the floor. There was no movement in the room, just silence. I decided I wanted out. Immediately, I got out of bed and went to the bedroom door. It would not open. The slam had apparently driven it tightly into the frame. I pulled, nothing, tried again, still stuck. At that point, I completely panicked. Until then, I had still been trying to convince myself the whole thing had an ordinary explanation. A dream. A cat. The old house. Whatever, but being unable to open the door made me feel trapped. I started crying, then yelling. I called for my dad. I screamed until he heard me from downstairs. Eventually, he came up. I remember trying to explain through the door that it was stuck. He came to the other side, and with barely any effort, he opened it. That detail bothered me almost as much as everything else. I had been pulling on the door and could not get it open. He hardly had to push. It opened. From his point of view, the explanation was obvious. I had been asleep. I had a nightmare. I woke up frightened. The door stuck because it was an old, swollen wooden door. Then I panicked. There was nothing mysterious about it. He told me I had been dreaming. I understand why he said that. If someone woke you around 5 in the morning crying and said invisible footsteps had run into the bedroom, slammed the door, walked around them on the mattress, and then disappeared, a dream would be the first explanation anyone would choose. It is still probably the strongest explanation. But even now, I remember how physical it felt. That is the part I have never been able to completely dismiss. I know what dreams feel like. I know the strange half-awake state where something from a dream seems to continue for a few seconds after you open your eyes. This felt different, at least in my memory. I remember already being awake before the footsteps started. I remember debating whether to get up or sleep longer. I could see the pink light outside. I knew where I was. Then I heard the running, the door, the bed. Everything seemed to happen in the real room. That does not mean it could not have been sleep-related. In fact, the timing makes a sleep-related explanation very possible. 5 in the morning is exactly the kind of time when someone might be drifting in and out of sleep. I may have felt awake while part of my brain was still dreaming. There are states between sleep and full wakefulness where people can hear footsteps, voices, doors, or other extremely realistic sounds. They can also experience physical sensations. Pressure on the mattress, something touching the body, a person sitting beside them, an animal walking across the bed. And unlike classic sleep paralysis, you do not necessarily have to be unable to move. That is important. People sometimes think that if you can move, then a sleep-related hallucination is impossible. It is not. The transition between sleeping and waking can be messy. A person can be conscious enough to know their room while still experiencing something dreamlike. Maybe that is what happened to me. Maybe I was lying there, drifting back towards sleep while thinking I was fully awake. The running footsteps happened inside that half-dream. The door slam happened there, too. The sensation on the mattress continued. Then I finally became completely awake. Opened my eyes. Nothing there. That fits surprisingly well. The door being stuck complicates it, but maybe not as much as it seems. The door already had a history of sticking. It was old, the wood swelled. It never closed properly. Maybe it had been pushed mostly shut the night before, and temperature or humidity caused it to wedge tighter overnight. When I woke frightened and pulled on it, I may have been pulling at the wrong angle. I was panicking, possibly shaking. Maybe I did not turn the knob completely. Maybe the latch had caught. Then my dad came upstairs, calm and standing on the opposite side, and pushed in exactly the direction that released it. To me, something slammed the door and trapped me inside. To him, old door stuck again. Both experiences could happen with the same physical door. The fact that it opened easily for him does not necessarily make it stranger. Old wooden doors can be inconsistent. Sometimes you pull and nothing happens. Push from the other side and it releases immediately. The frame can flex. The pressure is different. Maybe I was actually making it tighter by pulling. I did not understand any of that while terrified. There is another possibility. Maybe the door really did move. Old houses create airflow, especially houses that had been divided into apartments and then converted back. There may have been doors or vents in unusual positions. A window could have been opened downstairs. Another door could close. Pressure changes. A heavy door that usually sticks might remain partially open until the air pressure or weight shifts enough to move it. If the door was sitting right on the edge of the swollen section, perhaps it suddenly slipped past and slammed. That could explain the sound without anyone touching it. The footsteps are harder. But old houses can produce sounds that resemble footsteps remarkably well. Wood contracts overnight. Heating systems start. Pipes move. Animals can get into walls or attics. Something running across a roof or inside a ceiling can sound much heavier than it actually is. A squirrel can sound like a person. A raccoon can sound enormous. A farmhouse in the country gives plenty of animals opportunities to get close to the structure. Maybe something ran across the upstairs roof line or through part of the building. My half-awake brain located the sound inside the living room. Then the door moved from airflow or settling. Because the events happened close together, I connected them. Running thing reaches door. Door opens. Door slams. But maybe there was no single thing causing all of it. That is a common problem with frightening experiences. Several ordinary events happen within seconds. The brain turns them into one agent. Someone ran toward me and entered the room. That story is easier to understand than an animal moved somewhere in the structure while an old door shifted and I was half asleep. Then, there is the bed. That remains the strongest part for me. I did not only hear something. I felt the mattress move. It seemed to circle me. then settle at my feet. But mattresses can create strange sensations too, especially when you are lying still. Your own movements travel through the bed. Shift one leg. The mattress compresses elsewhere. A spring settles. A blanket slides. The frame moves. Old beds can pop and flex. If I was curled under blankets, trying to make myself small, my own movement may have caused sequential dips that my frightened brain interpreted as footsteps. Maybe I shifted one shoulder, then a knee, then my feet. Each movement creates another change in pressure. Under normal conditions, I would ignore it. After hearing someone apparently run into my room, every change in the bed becomes, it is walking around me. There could also have been an actual cat. That explanation should not be completely dismissed just because I did not see one when I looked. Cats move silently. A cat can jump off a bed without making much noise, especially onto carpet. Maybe one entered before the door shut, walked around the bed, lay near my feet, then jumped down while my eyes were closed. By the time I looked, it had moved somewhere else in the room or slipped through a gap before the door fully stuck. I do not remember whether we had cats at the time, but my own instinct immediately went to cat, which may mean that kind of animal was familiar in the household. Or maybe I simply used a cat because the movement resembled what cats do. Without knowing whether there was actually a cat in the house, I cannot treat that as the answer. But the pattern of movement is extremely animal-like. Circle, settle, that is interesting. If the whole thing was a sleep-related experience, the brain may have borrowed a familiar body sensation. Maybe I had slept with pets before. The mind knows exactly how a cat walking across a mattress feels. So when constructing a half-dream, it used that sensation. The same way people dream of phones vibrating because their brain knows that feeling. There is also the possibility that I was dreaming about a cat and simply woke during it. The footsteps and door could have been part of the same dream narrative. That would explain why the experience had such a clear sequence. Running entry bed movement. Rest dreams create stories quickly. The problem is that from inside them, especially during waking, they can feel indistinguishable from reality. The early morning light probably reinforced that. My room was actually visible. I was not in some dream version of the house. I may have been looking at the real doorway while hearing and feeling dream content layered over it. That is what makes these experiences so convincing. The setting is real, only the intruder is not. I do not like saying it was just a dream, though. That phrase sounds dismissive. Whatever happened, the fear was real enough that I screamed until my dad came upstairs. I was not pretending. I did not wake and decide to tell a scary story. I genuinely believed something had entered my room. Even if the source was my own sleeping brain, the experience itself was extremely real to me. Another thing that made it convincing was the order. I heard footsteps before I shut my eyes. At least that is how I remember it. I did not wake from a nightmare already frightened. I was casually thinking about whether I should get more sleep. Then a sound happened. That makes me want to treat the footsteps as external. Maybe they were. Perhaps some actual sound woke the threat response. A real animal, a family member moving downstairs, something outside. The brain then built the rest. This hybrid explanation makes a lot of sense to me. Real sound, half-awake brain, old door. Dream like bodily sensation. Panic, a single genuine noise can trigger an entire false interpretation. Maybe someone downstairs moved quickly. Sound traveled strangely through the house. Because the old building had once been 2 apartments, the floors and walls may have carried sound in ways I did not expect. I heard running and thought it was upstairs. Then, The door shifted. Then fear and sleep created the sensation on the mattress. There is no need for every part to have one cause. The sky turning pink matters too. At that time of morning, light changes quickly. Shadows in the room soften. Your eyes are adapting. The brain is trying to decide whether it is still nighttime or morning. I may have been repeatedly falling asleep for seconds without realizing it. Micro dreams can happen when someone is fighting sleep. You think you have been awake continuously. In reality, you drift off. Dream, wake, because the gap was short, it feels like one uninterrupted period of awareness. Maybe my debate about getting up or going back to sleep ended with me actually going back to sleep for a few seconds. Long enough for the entire event to happen. Then I woke at the moment I thought I was still experiencing it. That could make the memory especially confusing. Memory does not contain a label saying, this part was dream. This part was real. It just stores the sequence. The door itself may even have been open the whole time. I remember hearing it open and slam. But did I actually see it? My eyes were closed. That is crucial. Once I heard the footsteps, I shut my eyes. Everything after that, until I checked the bed, was based largely on sound and touch. I did not visually watch the door open. I did not visually watch it close. I did not see anything enter. I did not see an animal circle me. That leaves a lot of room for misinterpretation. I heard what sounded like the door. I felt what seemed like steps. Those perceptions can be incredibly convincing without matching external events. When I finally opened my eyes, the room was empty. That is the first direct visual evidence I had after the event began. Nothing was there. The door was closed, or at least stuck enough that I could not get out. That physical detail is what kept the whole event from becoming obviously dreamlike. But again, the door was known to stick. Maybe it had already been shut before I fell asleep. Maybe my memory inserted the sound of its slamming into the dream. I may have woken to find it stuck and assumed the sound had happened seconds earlier. That is possible too. People incorporate real environmental conditions into dreams all the time. A closed door in the real room becomes a slammed door in the dream. Pressure from blankets becomes something sitting on the bed. A sound outside becomes footsteps. Then you wake and some of the evidence appears to match. That makes the dream feel prophetic or external, when really it was being built from sensory information your brain was already receiving. I have also thought about the possibility of an actual person. Could someone have been upstairs? A family member? One of my siblings visiting? My dad? Could somebody have run into the room as a prank? The problem is that my dad's reaction does not fit. He came to help because I was screaming. He thought I had dreamed it. If he had been the one running upstairs seconds earlier, he would know. And there was no reason for someone to come in, walk around on my bed, then vanish. A human intruder is even less likely. We live 10 minutes outside town on a farm. Someone would have to enter the house unnoticed, run upstairs, slam themselves into my bedroom, somehow create the feeling of walking on my bed, then disappear without opening the stuck door. That does not work. So I do not think a physical person explains it. An animal is more plausible. A cat could move across a bed. A larger animal could make running sounds outside the room. But the closed door becomes an issue. If something entered and the door slammed shut, where did it go? No animal was there when I looked, unless it hid. Cats can hide ridiculously well. Under a bed, behind furniture, in a closet. Maybe I ran for the door so quickly that I never searched. Then, when my dad opened it, the animal slipped out later. Possible, but I do not remember finding one. Nothing afterward confirmed it. The house never developed a pattern of this happening either. That matters to me. No repeated running footsteps, No invisible things walking on my bed every morning. No door slamming every night. No ongoing haunting. It was a one-time event. One morning around 5. That makes an unusual sleep state or a coincidence, much more likely than some persistent presence in the house. If something supernatural had decided to interact with me physically, why once? Why exactly while I was half awake? Why behave like a cat? Why never do it again? Those questions do not prove anything, but they make the paranormal explanation less necessary. Sleep-related experiences, on the other hand, are often isolated. They happen when the right conditions line up. Fatigue, stress, irregular sleep. Early morning, a strange room, then never repeat. Senior year can also be stressful. New town, new school, family move. Even if I did not consciously feel overwhelmed, the brain can carry stress into sleep. That can make vivid dreams and strange awakenings more likely. I do not remember being especially stressed that specific night, but I had a lot changing in my life. Moving senior year is not small. New environment, old farmhouse, different noises, more isolation. All of those could influence sleep without me realizing it. The fact that I loved having the upstairs to myself may actually have made me more vulnerable to being startled. Privacy is great during the day. At 5 in the morning, being alone on an entire floor means any unexpected sound immediately matters. There is no easy explanation like, my sister is moving around. If I knew nobody should be upstairs, footsteps became threatening automatically. The house itself probably had a completely different soundscape than what I grew up with. Old buildings move, farmhouses especially. Wood expands. Contracts, pipes, wind, animals, branches. The bigger and emptier a space is, the more dramatic those sounds become. Maybe I had heard similar noises before, but slept through them. That morning, I happened to be awake. The result became one of the strongest memories I have from the house. My dad's reaction is also useful in hindsight. He barely had to press the door to open it. At the time, that felt impossible. I had struggled. Why could he open it? But panic changes how you interact with simple objects. People pull doors that need pushing, turn handles halfway, forget locks, use the wrong angle. When your hands are shaking and you believe something invisible is trapped in the room with you, fine motor control is not exactly at its best. Maybe the door was not strongly jammed at all. Maybe I thought it was because the first pull failed. Then, panic escalated. My dad approached calmly, applied pressure. Open, that is probably the least mysterious part. But emotionally, it was enormous. I needed the door to open. It did not. So the room became a trap. Then Dad arrived and opened it like nothing was wrong. That made me feel even more isolated in the experience. To him, there was no problem. To me, something had just entered the room and physically walked around me. That difference is why Bad Dream never fully satisfied me. He had not been there for the sensations. He had not heard what I heard. But that does not mean he was wrong. Maybe he simply had the advantage of seeing the event from the outside. The most likely explanation is that I had a vivid sleep-related experience while partially awake. The old house supplied real noises. The sticky door supplied a physical detail. My brain supplied the rest. That is what I would tell someone else if they described the same story. And yet I understand why the person who experienced it would say, no, I know what I felt. Because I do. I remember the mattress. That is what survives every rational explanation. Not the footsteps, not even the door, the bed. That distinct sensation of something placing weight beside me, moving around, then settling at my feet. It was so familiar, so physical, so much like an animal, I could feel where it was. I was certain enough to calm myself with the thought that it must be a cat. Then I looked. Nothing. That empty space at my feet is still the image that bothers me most. If there had been a cat, the entire experience would have collapsed instantly. I probably would have laughed, maybe cursed at it for scaring me, then gone back to sleep. Instead, there was only the blanket. And once the ordinary explanation disappeared, everything that happened before it became frightening again. Maybe the cat was only the explanation my brain invented because the sensation itself came from a dream. That makes sense. But knowing that does not recreate the feeling. I also wonder if the mattress itself was settling under me. Older mattresses can shift after someone changes position. Springs redistribute pressure. Foam slowly returns to shape. If I curled tightly under the blanket after hearing the door, I changed my weight distribution dramatically. The bed might have responded in stages. One side dips, then another. Then the foot area shifts. My brain, already looking for an intruder, interprets those movements as footsteps. Once the motion stops, it feels like something is laying down. That is a surprisingly good physical explanation. It would also explain why nothing jumped off the bed. Nothing had been there. The mattress was responding to me. Again, fear turns random physical feedback into agency. Something is moving. Something chose to lie there. That word, something, is the entire mystery. We are extremely sensitive to perceived intention. A door slamming is scary. A thing slamming the door is much scarier. A mattress shifting is annoying. Something walking around you is terrifying. The same raw sensations become completely different once the brain assigns an agent. Maybe that morning was just a perfect storm of normal sensations being assigned to one invisible visitor. Footsteps, door, bed, 3 events. One imagined cause. Someone ran into my room. That story formed instantly and has been difficult to break ever since. I do not think my dad was dismissing me cruelly when he said I had a bad dream. He was probably trying to calm me down, and in all likelihood, he was right. Maybe not a normal dream, maybe some strange halfway state, but sleep is still where I would put the explanation. That does not make me feel stupid. The brain can create experiences so convincing that people will swear for the rest of their lives that they physically happened. That is not weakness. It is just how perception works when consciousness is shifting. I was at exactly the right time of morning for that. The sky turning pink. Body still tired. Mind partly awake, trying to decide whether to get up. That is a textbook situation for drifting between states without realizing it. What makes the memory valuable to me now is not proving whether the house was haunted. I do not think I can. There is not enough evidence. It happened once. I was the only witness. I was in bed. It was early morning. Nothing remained afterward. Those facts strongly favor a sleep-related explanation. But I can still remember how helpless I felt. I had gone from loving the freedom of having most of the upstairs to myself to desperately wanting another person there. All that wonderful privacy became isolation in seconds. The upstairs living room outside my bedroom seemed huge. The old door suddenly mattered. The distance downstairs to my family suddenly mattered. That is how quickly a familiar house can change. One frightening experience in the architecture takes on a different meaning. The door is not just old, it traps you. The empty living room is not private. Something can run through it. The bed is not safe. Something can climb onto it. Then morning fully arrives. Your dad opens the door. Sunlight fills the place. And everything becomes normal again. That contrast almost makes the night worse. Nothing looks capable of what you experienced. There is no physical aftermath, no explanation sitting in the corner, just an old farmhouse and a swollen door. I never got proof that anything unusual was in the room. No footprints, no animal hair, no damage, no other witness. Nothing. If the experience happened today, I would probably approach it very differently. I would recognize the possibility of a half-awake hallucination immediately. I would check the room, look under the bed, check for animals, test the door, listen to the house. Maybe I would find the explanation within minutes. At 17, I wanted out, and I think that was fair. At that moment, my body was completely convinced I was not alone. You do not reason perfectly while terrified. You escape first. The unanswered questions come later. Mine came for years. Was I actually awake? Did the door really slam? Was something on the mattress? Could the house have shifted? Could a cat have escaped before I looked? Was the running outside the room? Could the whole sequence have been a vivid dream built around real sounds? Every explanation solves part of it. None gives me a replay. So I live with the uncertainty. I do not say a ghost climbed into bed with me. That would be more certainty than I have. I say that one morning around 5, I heard something run toward my bedroom. I shut my eyes. I heard the old door open and slam. Then I felt something move in a circle around me on the mattress and settle at my feet. When I finally looked, there was nothing there. I tried to leave and found the door stuck. I panicked until my dad came upstairs. Then he opened it with almost no effort and told me I had dreamed the whole thing. Maybe I did. That is probably the answer. But nearly every part of a dream disappears once you wake. This one never really did. I can still picture the pink morning light, still remember curling under the blanket, still remember telling myself it was just a cat. And most of all, I still remember the exact moment I opened my eyes, expecting to see an animal lying at my feet. There was nothing there. That is the part my dad never experienced. Maybe that is why, even after all these years, his explanation makes sense to me without ever feeling completely satisfying. Because if it was a dream, it was the only dream I ever had where I remember the mattress changing under me one step at a time, something circling my body, and then the unmistakable feeling of weight settling down at my feet before I opened my eyes to an empty bed. When I was around 10 years old, I had one of those experiences that lasted only a few seconds, but stayed in my memory for years. It happened one evening while I was outside playing with a friend. It was around 8 o'clock, and it was getting late enough that she needed to go home. We had been out for a while, doing normal kid stuff, and when it was time for her to leave, I walked her back to her house. Nothing felt unusual. There was no storm, no strange sound, no weird feeling beforehand. It was just an ordinary evening. After I left her house, I started walking back toward mine by myself. I was not particularly scared. I knew the area. It was familiar. There were still people around. And somewhere behind me, there was a family walking in the same general direction. I could hear them talking. At first, I was not paying attention to what they were saying. Then their voices changed. They sounded confused. One of them said something like, "What the hell is that?" Another said, "Look at the sky." That got my attention. When several people behind you suddenly stop talking normally and start reacting to something overhead, you look. So, I did. I looked up, and there were 3 lights in the sky. That is the part I remember clearly. 3 separate lights. They were moving together in a circular pattern. Not slowly. Fast, they seemed to be spinning around one another in a tight circle. It did not look like three stars. Stars do not suddenly move like that. It did not look like normal planes passing each other either. The movement was too coordinated, too quick. For around 5 seconds, maybe a little more or less, I watched those lights spin. Then they were gone. They did not slowly fade. They did not continue moving until they disappeared over the horizon. They seemed to just disappear. At least, that is how I remember it. The whole thing happened so fast that by the time I fully understood I was looking at something strange, it was already over. I stood there for a moment, trying to work out what I had just seen. The family behind me had seen it too. That was important. If I had been alone, I probably would have questioned myself immediately. Maybe I saw a reflection. Maybe I was looking at stars through moving clouds. Maybe I imagined the movement. But other people had reacted before I even looked up. They were the reason I noticed it in the first place. So there was definitely something in the sky that caught their attention too. I did not know who they were. I did not stop and interview them. I was 10. I just knew I was not the only person looking up. That made the experience feel real. I went home. As soon as I got there, I told my parents. I was probably talking quickly because the whole thing had happened only minutes earlier. 3 lights, spinning in a circle, really fast, then disappearing. My mom did not believe me, or at least she did not take it seriously. She thought I was making it up or exaggerating. That was frustrating because I knew I had seen something, and the family behind me had clearly seen it too. But I was 10. Adults do not always take strange stories from children seriously, especially when the story involves unexplained lights in the sky. Then my dad reacted differently. He believed me, not just because he wanted to make me feel better. He had a reason. He told me that around 30 years earlier, when he was younger, he had seen almost the exact same thing. According to him, he had been walking home with some friends after a high school reunion. They looked up and saw 3 lights in the sky. 3, just like mine. They were moving in a circle. Then, according to him, they suddenly shot off and disappeared. He said he had never seen anything like it again. I remember listening to him and getting this strange feeling. Because before he told me that, my experience was only something weird I had seen. Afterward, it felt like part of something bigger. He had seen 3 lights. I had seen 3 lights. His had spun in a circle. Mine had spun in a circle. His disappeared. Mine disappeared. And these events were separated by decades. At 10 years old, that sounded almost impossible to dismiss. What were the chances? For a while, I thought maybe my dad and I had both seen the same kind of UFO. Not necessarily aliens. I did not know what it was, but something unusual. Something that had been appearing in the same kind of way for decades. As I got older, though, I started thinking about the story differently. I still believe I saw 3 lights. I do not think I invented that. The fact that other people reacted first makes me especially confident that there was a real visual event. But seeing something real does not mean my interpretation of it was correct. The first question is what 3 lights spinning in a circle actually means from the ground. Distance in the night sky is extremely hard to judge. I had no idea whether the lights were hundreds of feet away, several miles away, or much farther. I did not know whether they were large lights far away or small lights relatively close. Without reference points, the sky gives you almost no scale. If 3 aircraft were moving independently at different distances, they could briefly appear to circle one another from my viewing angle. Perspective can create coordinated-looking motion that is not actually coordinated. Imagine 2 aircraft turning while a third moves straight. From one point on the ground, the paths may overlap in a way that looks like a rotating triangle. The actual aircraft could be nowhere near each other. That is possible. Helicopters are another possibility. 3 helicopters maneuvering in formation could produce something similar. Military or police aircraft sometimes train together, but the speed I remember feels too fast for that. The lights seem to move around the circle very quickly. Still, memory of speed is difficult when there is no scale. A tiny circle far away could represent large aircraft making broad turns. A larger-looking circle could be something much closer. At 10 years old, I could not judge any of that. There is also the possibility of spotlights. That explanation is interesting because multiple searchlights projected onto clouds can create bright moving points that seem to be objects in the sky. If 3 beams are sweeping in circles, you may see 3 bright patches rotating rapidly on the underside of clouds. Then if the beams switch off or move beyond the cloud layer, the lights appear to disappear instantly. That would fit several details. 3 lights, circular movement, fast speed, sudden disappearance. Searchlights can move much faster across clouds than physical aircraft can move through the sky. A motorized light on the ground can sweep a beam through a huge angle in seconds. The bright spot on a cloud might travel an enormous apparent distance almost instantly. To someone on the ground, it looks like a glowing object moving impossibly fast. If there were 3 synchronized lights, they could easily rotate in a circle. Businesses, events, fairs, concerts, cinemas, or promotions sometimes use moving spotlights. Maybe there was something like that happening somewhere outside my immediate area. I would not necessarily see the source. I might only see the illuminated spots on clouds. At 10, I probably would not even think of that explanation. The problem is that I do not clearly remember clouds. The sky may have been clear, maybe not. That detail did not stick. If the lights were projected onto clouds, there had to be enough cloud cover for the beams to become visible as spots. If the sky was perfectly clear, searchlights become less likely. But old memories often preserve the strange object and lose the weather. So I cannot use that confidently. Another possibility is aircraft navigation lights. At night, you often do not see the aircraft itself. You see only bright points. If multiple aircraft are turning, the lights can appear and disappear depending on orientation. A plane's landing light can look extremely bright when pointed toward you. Then the aircraft turns a few degrees and the light seems to vanish instantly. That could explain the sudden disappearance. Maybe the 3 objects did not fly away at impossible speed. Maybe their brightest lights simply turned away from me at around the same time. If they were flying in formation, that could happen together. Again, that would look very strange from the ground. There is also the possibility of drones. Today, 3 drones flying synchronized patterns would not be unusual. They can move in circles. They can turn lights on and off. They can disappear quickly from view. But depending on exactly when this happened, consumer drones may not have been common enough for that to be the best explanation. I was around 10, and this was roughly 8 or 9 years before the original telling, so it would have been sometime in the early or mid-2010s. Drones existed then, but coordinated light displays were less common than they are now. Still possible. My dad's sighting 30 years earlier obviously could not be explained by modern consumer drones. That similarity is what makes the story feel more mysterious. But it is important not to assume the 2 events had the same cause simply because they sound alike. This is where memory becomes especially interesting. When I told my dad I saw 3 lights spinning in a circle and then they disappeared, he responded with his own old memory. He may genuinely have remembered 3 lights. I have no reason to think he lied. But old memories are flexible. 30 years is a long time. He may originally have seen several lights moving strangely. After hearing my description, his memory may have become organized around the same structure. 3. Circle, disappear, that does not require dishonesty. Memory naturally updates itself when we retell it. A vague old experience can become more specific when something reminds us of it. Maybe he had always remembered exactly 3 lights. Maybe not. There is no way for me to know. The fact that he was with friends does make his story stronger in one sense. Other people apparently saw something too. But again, shared witnesses confirm a stimulus more than an interpretation. A group can all see the same lights and still be wrong about their distance, movement, or nature. The family behind me works the same way. Their reaction confirms that there was something unusual enough to notice. It does not tell me what the lights were. One detail that matters is that I looked up only after hearing them react. That means I was already primed before I saw anything. What the hell is that? Look at the sky. Those words told my brain, something strange is up there. I did not look neutrally. I looked expecting something unusual. That can influence how motion is perceived. If I had happened to look up without hearing them first, maybe I would have thought 3 aircraft or spotlights. But because several adults were already confused, my brain knew ordinary explanations were apparently failing them too. That made the lights feel more mysterious from the first second. Still, they really were looking. Something had caught their attention before mine. That is why I cannot dismiss the sighting as entirely imagined. Another thing to consider is how short the event was. Around 5 seconds. That is not much time. When something surprising happens for 5 seconds, your brain spends the first second or two simply recognizing it. Then you start trying to understand. Then it is gone. You never get a chance to study the details carefully. Were the lights perfectly circular? Or did they form a rough triangle that changed shape? Were they literally rotating around one central point? Or were they crossing paths? Did they vanish all at once? Or one after another so quickly it felt simultaneous? Did they shoot away? Or simply fade? These differences matter enormously when trying to identify an aerial event. But a 10-year-old who sees it for 5 seconds is not recording those distinctions. The memory becomes 3 lights spinning really fast, then gone. That may be accurate enough emotionally, while still losing technical detail. The speed may also have grown in memory. A light crossing a section of sky in 1 second feels extremely fast. But without knowing its distance, speed cannot be estimated. A plane far away, moving at hundreds of miles per hour, can seem slow. A spotlight projected onto a nearby cloud can seem impossibly fast. A small insect close to your face can appear to cross huge parts of your visual field instantly. Distance changes everything. Could the lights have been something very close, like insects reflecting light? Probably not, because the family behind me reacted too. For multiple people to see the same 3 insects from different positions would be unlikely. So I think the lights were genuinely far enough away to be visible to everyone. Could they have been birds reflecting light? At around 8 in the evening, depending on season, birds could still be moving. But 3 bright points circling in a coordinated pattern seems less likely. Birds can catch sunlight high in the sky after the ground has become dark. Their bodies flash bright when wings turn at certain angles. A small flock can appear and disappear repeatedly. But the spinning circle description does not fit especially well. Satellites are another possibility people might suggest. 3 satellites in formation? There are groups of satellites that travel together. But satellites generally move steadily across the sky. They do not circle one another rapidly from our perspective. They can brighten and fade, but the circular movement makes them a poor fit. Meteors also do not fit. They usually travel in straight or gently curved paths and last seconds. 3 meteors circling would be extremely unusual. So I think the more likely ordinary categories are aircraft or projected lights. There may be other possibilities I am missing. The event was too brief and too long ago to identify with certainty. The sudden disappearance is probably easier to explain than it felt at the time. Lights in the sky vanish for many reasons. Clouds, orientation, switching off, moving behind something, atmospheric haze. The human eye also loses dim objects quickly once brighter lights disappear. If 3 aircraft turned together, their forward-facing lights could all become invisible nearly at once. If searchlights were shut off, the effect would be instantaneous. From the ground, both looked like they vanished. My dad's version included them shooting off. That sounds more dramatic. But again, a moving light can appear to accelerate enormously if it is a spotlight or if its brightness changes as it moves. Imagine a light spot sweeping across cloud cover, and then the beam quickly moves away. Your brain may interpret the last movement as the object shooting away. Maybe that is what he saw. Maybe he and his friends saw a completely different phenomenon. The stories may only resemble each other because 3 strange lights moving together is a fairly common type of unidentified aerial sighting. People have reported groups of lights for decades. That does not prove a single underlying cause. Many different things can look similar at night. Aircraft formations, flares, searchlights, balloons with lights, satellites, atmospheric effects, human-made objects that change over time. The sky is a perfect place for mistaken identity because there is no easy scale. Still, I understand why my dad's story affected me so strongly. If he had simply said, "I believe you," the experience might have remained a weird childhood memory. Instead, he said, "I saw the same thing." That turned it into a family mystery. For years, the fact that his sighting had happened around 30 years earlier made it feel almost like whatever I saw had returned. 3 lights doing the same thing across generations. That sounds eerie, but there is another possibility. Maybe the similarity is less exact than it feels now. When people tell stories, we naturally emphasize matching details. My sighting, 3 lights. Dad, I saw 3 too. Mine, they went in a circle. Dad, ours did that too. Mine, then, they disappeared. Dad, ours disappeared too. Every match receives attention. Differences fade. Maybe his lights were much higher. Maybe they lasted minutes. Maybe they were different colors. Maybe they moved in a triangle instead of a circle. Maybe he originally saw 4 and only remembered 3 later. I do not know, because his story was already decades old when he told it. That is why I cannot use the similarity as proof of anything. It is interesting, very interesting, but not proof. I also wonder whether there were local sources capable of producing the same visual effect decades apart. An airport, military exercises, a nearby base, a venue that periodically used searchlights, weather patterns that produced unusual reflections. If both of us lived in or near the same region when the sightings happened, there could be a location-specific explanation. Maybe aircraft commonly practiced there. Maybe events regularly used rotating spotlights. Maybe there was an airfield whose approach pattern caused 3 lights to appear to rotate from certain streets. In that case, seeing similar things decades apart would not be surprising at all. The environment stayed similar. Different observers encountered the same type of normal phenomenon. I do not remember enough information to test that. The exact location, direction I was facing, weather, season, whether there were clouds, whether any event was happening nearby. Without those details, the sighting cannot really be reconstructed. That is what happens with childhood mysteries. You preserve the part that shocked you, not the information you would need later to solve it. I remember 8 o'clock, walking home, family behind me. 3 lights, fast circle. Gone, Dad's old story. That is enough for a powerful memory, not enough for identification. I do think it is worth separating the event from the label UFO. Technically, at the time, they were unidentified flying objects to me because I could not identify them. But that does not mean alien spacecraft. Unidentified simply means I did not know what they were. That is where I still stand. I saw 3 lights I could not identify. Other people noticed them. They moved in a way I did not understand. Then I lost sight of them. Everything beyond that is interpretation. There is no need to jump immediately to aliens. The lights did not land. No figures appeared. No strange message. Nothing happened to us afterward. It was a sky observation. A very strange one. But only that. The fact that my mom did not believe me actually strengthened my attachment to the story. When a child tells an adult something weird, and the adult immediately dismisses it, the child often becomes more determined to remember it. You repeat the details internally. I know what I saw. 3. Circle. 5 seconds. Gone, that defensive repetition can make the core memory very stable. It can also make it more rigid. You stop questioning your first interpretation because questioning feels like agreeing with the person who dismissed you. My dad's belief probably reinforced that. Now I had one adult saying, "You're full of it," and another saying, "No, I saw the exact same thing." Naturally, I sided with Dad. His experience validated mine. At 10, there was no reason for me to start analyzing perspective and atmospheric optics. I just thought, Dad knows. He saw it too. That emotional validation matters more to childhood memory than technical explanation. I still think he probably did see something. Again, multiple witnesses in his story. No reason to assume he invented it. But I no longer think same thing necessarily means same object or same cause. Humans describe visual patterns with a limited vocabulary. 3 lights, triangle, circle, spinning, shooting off. These descriptions can apply to many different events. 2 people decades apart can use the same words for completely different sources. That is common. There is also the possibility that the lights were attached to one object. Maybe I interpreted 3 lights as 3 separate objects, but they were fixed points on a single aircraft. If that craft banked or rotated, the 3 lights would appear to spin around one another. Then if it turned away, all 3 could disappear together. That could produce exactly the impression I remember. Large aircraft have multiple lights. Helicopters, too. From far away at night, you cannot see the body between them. You see only separate points. Your brain assumes 3 things. But maybe it was 1. If the object was banking sharply, the configuration could rotate fast. Then once the lights pointed away, darkness. That is a simple possibility I had never considered as a child. Would a normal aircraft bank in such a tight-looking circle? Depends on distance and angle. Again, without scale, impossible to judge. It could also have been a formation of 3 aircraft. Military aircraft often fly coordinated maneuvers that look unusual to people who do not know what they are watching. At night, with only lights visible, even normal turns can seem impossible. If the family behind me also seemed confused, that does not rule out aircraft. Most people are not experts at identifying aerial maneuvers at night. Another possibility is that the lights were reflections on a cloud layer from something on the ground. This still feels like one of the strongest explanations because of the rapid circular movement. If you have ever seen advertising searchlights, they can look incredibly strange when you cannot see the beams. 3 bright circles moving around clouds can look exactly like objects chasing one another. Then, they vanish when the light operators change the pattern. The whole thing can happen in seconds. The family behind me might have reacted because from our location the source was hidden. No visible event, no obvious building, only lights overhead. That would definitely produce what the hell is that? If I could go back and investigate one thing, I would want to know whether there were clouds. That one detail would help a lot. If there was low cloud cover, searchlights jump much higher on the list. If the sky was completely clear and full of stars, then physical aircraft become more likely. Unfortunately, I do not remember. I remember the lights. Memory gives priority to novelty. Weather is background. The fact that it was around 8 also matters. Depending on time of year, the sky may not have been fully dark. Twilight can make aircraft lights stand out while hiding the aircraft body. It can also create reflected sunlight on high objects. If it was summer, maybe there was still some light. If winter, it could have been completely dark. Again, missing context. I also cannot remember the color of the lights. White? Yellow? Maybe if they had been red, green, or blinking, I might have identified them more easily as aircraft. Because I remember only lights, they were probably bright enough that color was not the important detail. But that is speculation. The exact color could have faded from memory. The duration is equally uncertain. I say 5 seconds. Could have been 3. Could have been 10. When something surprises you, time estimation is poor. 5 seconds is probably shorthand for long enough to watch them move, but very brief. That is the safest way to describe it. If they were visible for only a few seconds, there was no opportunity to get a parent outside. No phone video. No chance to track where they went. That is why the event remained unresolved. Today, someone would probably pull out a phone immediately. But even then, 5 seconds is barely enough. By the time you unlock the screen, camera opens and points upward. It is over. So even in a modern setting, a sighting like that might leave nothing behind. The family behind me are the lost witnesses I think about sometimes. I wish I had spoken to them. Asked, what did you see? Did they also see exactly 3? Did they think the lights were spinning? Did they see them disappear? Maybe their description would have matched mine perfectly. That would strengthen the event. Or maybe they would have said, those were spotlights. And the mystery would have ended immediately. At 10, I did not think to ask. They were strangers. I was going home. The event was over. That opportunity disappeared with the lights. Sometimes I imagine what their version of the story might be. Maybe one of them remembers the same evening. They were walking together when someone noticed 3 strange lights. A kid ahead of them looked up too. Then the lights vanished. Maybe they went home and forgot about it. Maybe they still tell the story. There is no way to know. That is another strange thing about shared public experiences. A group of strangers can witness the same event and then separate permanently. Each carries a private version. No one compares notes. The event becomes multiple isolated memories instead of one documented sighting. My dad's story added another layer of that. He had friends with him. Maybe some of them still remember. Maybe if we asked them separately, their accounts would be very different now. That would be interesting. Shared experiences often converge in the moment, but diverge over decades. One person remembers 3 lights. Another remembers 4. One says they moved in circles. Another says zigzags. Another barely remembers anything. That does not mean the original event was fake. It shows how memory changes. If all of them independently remembered the same unusual details after 30 years, that would be more striking. But I never had that information. So I cannot use my dad's friends as independent confirmation. I only have my dad saying they were there. That is enough for family storytelling, not enough for certainty. Still, I understand why his words gave me chills. He did not say, "I saw something similar once." He said it was essentially the same thing. 3 lights, spinning, disappearing, and he had not seen them again in 30 years. Then I saw them once. And, as far as I know, never again. That one time, nature gives both stories a weird symmetry. But rare things happen. A person can see a strange aircraft formation once in their life, a searchlight display once, an atmospheric effect once. 2 members of one family can both have rare sky sightings without those sightings being connected. The world is full of unusual but ordinary events. When they happen to relatives, they feel more meaningful. We are pattern seeking. That is not a flaw. It is how we make sense of things. But sometimes the pattern is coincidence. The most honest conclusion I can reach now is that I saw something real and unidentified. The family behind me supports that. The exact nature remains unknown. My dad probably had his own real unidentified sighting decades earlier. The similarity is interesting, but it does not prove they were caused by the same thing. Could it have been something genuinely unusual? Of course. Unusual is exactly what unidentified means. Could it have been technology or atmospheric effects I did not recognize? Very likely. Could it have been aliens? There is nothing in my experience that allows me to make that leap. Lights alone are not enough. I think that distinction is important. The story is actually more interesting when I do not force an answer. I was 10, walking home. A family behind me suddenly reacted. I looked up. 3 points of light were moving in a way I had never seen before. For a few seconds, they seemed to chase each other around a circle. Then, the sky was empty. That is what happened, from my perspective. I went home expecting my parents to tell me what it was. My mom dismissed it. My dad did the opposite. Instead of giving me an explanation, he gave me another mystery. 30 years earlier, he and his friends had apparently looked up at the sky and watched 3 lights move in almost the exact same way. As a kid, I thought that made the experience more believable. As an adult, I think it makes the story more complicated. Maybe there really was a recurring phenomenon. Maybe the same kind of aircraft or light effect appeared decades apart. Maybe both sightings were unrelated, but happened to share a pattern. Maybe my dad's memory shifted slightly after hearing mine. Any of those could be true. I do not know. The only thing I am confident about is that the sky can produce events that look much stranger than they really are. Without distance, scale, sound, or context, 3 lights can become almost anything. You can spend years trying to turn 5 seconds of visual information into a complete explanation. There simply may not be enough information available. That is where I eventually stopped. Not because I decided nothing happened. Something happened. I just stopped treating the lack of an explanation as evidence for one particular explanation. I still think about my dad's reaction, though. That is what keeps the story alive for me. If my mom had been the only response, maybe I would have eventually convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I would say, I was 10. Probably saw planes. Who knows? But then my dad looked at me and described something from his own life that sounded almost exactly like what I had just seen. That is difficult to forget. It was not a story he told me beforehand. At least, I do not remember ever hearing it. That matters because if I had already known about his sighting, suggestion could have shaped mine. But as far as I remember, I had no idea. I told him first, then he told me. That order made the similarity feel much stronger. Still, I cannot reconstruct the conversation word for word after all these years. Maybe I had heard some version of his story earlier and forgotten. Maybe he described his event less precisely than I remember. Again, childhood memory. Possibly, but the emotional truth remains. I went home with a mystery. My dad answered it with another one. And the second mystery was 30 years older than mine. I have never seen those lights again. No second chance. No opportunity to watch longer. No video. No explanation appearing years later. Just that one evening. Sometimes when I look at the night sky now, I think about how much we normally ignore. Planes, satellites, drones, reflections, clouds, lights from the ground. Most of the time, the brain identifies them instantly. Plane, star, helicopter, done. Then once in a while, something does not fit quickly enough. It moves at the wrong speed, turns strangely, disappears, and for a few seconds, the sky becomes unfamiliar. That is what happened to me. Maybe if I saw the exact same thing today, I would recognize it immediately. Maybe I would say, oh, those are searchlights, or 3 aircraft turning in formation. And the childhood mystery would collapse. I would actually like that. There is something satisfying about finally understanding a strange memory. But there is also a possibility that I would look up today and still have no idea. 3 lights. Fast circle. Gone. And maybe that is why the story still works on me. Not because I think my dad and I were chosen by aliens. Not because I think there is some 3-light object returning every 30 years. But because 2 people in the same family, separated by decades, both ended up with a memory of looking into the sky and seeing almost the same impossible-looking pattern. Maybe coincidence. Maybe ordinary lights. Maybe 2 completely different events. I can accept all of that. But I still remember being 10 years old, stopping on the walk home because strangers behind me were saying, "What the hell is that?" I looked up expecting maybe a plane. Instead, 3 lights were spinning around one another so fast that I could not make sense of them. A few seconds later, they were gone. Then I went home and told my dad. And instead of explaining what I had seen, he looked at me and told me that 30 years earlier, he and his friends had once stood under a different night sky, watching 3 lights do almost exactly the same thing.
Tonight's stories are over, but darkness has a way of making memories feel closer. Some people never forgot what they saw. Others never learned what was behind the sound, the voice, or the shape waiting just outside the light. Tell me in the comments which story you will be thinking about after this ends. Subscribe to Wickless Night for more true accounts from the hours when no one wants to be awake alone. Sleep carefully and do not trust every shadow that stays still.